So it took me a really long time to develop any form of studio work that I thought complemented the work I was doing out of the studio. In fact, it took me a really long time to get comfortable in a studio at all. One of the main problems I had was translating my natural light style into a studio. So before I talk about how I started to solve that problem, I should probably explain what I believe my definition of my natural light style is. So I shoot quite often in open shade, soft light or backlit. I use longer lenses for compression. I tend to shoot wide open, so apertures between 1.4, 1.2, 1.4 up to about 2.8 at the absolute highest. I would very much say that my style is to remove the subject from their environment and put a lot of emphasis on the subject rather than contextualize them. And then to take that and translate that into studio work I found really hard. I was struggling a little bit because I didn't have any influences as far as studio work goes that I felt their work or their style would complement the way that I did natural light work, so it was very hard for me to find some kind of balance. Nowadays there are plenty of options for high speed sync, flash and so on, but when this was a problem, which was going back about 5 years, that was something that was left really to speedlights, and the availability of modifiers for speedlights was not particularly impressive. I'm not a big fan of speedlights anyway, which I could go into in another video. And I'd actually recently purchased a set of Bowen's studio strobes to do some work from home. And the problem with those Bowens is that the fastest sync speed is about 160th before it starts getting a bit iffy. So I wanted to find a way that I could utilize the Bowens and produce that narrow depth of field work that I love. So the immediate thing I started, and I think where most people would probably think to start, was because they were 200 watt, quite a low power strobe, I would just drop them all the way to the bottom power setting and shoot, and it would allow me to probably shoot around 2.8, 3.2, and I was getting the look I wanted, but at a cost. And this is the next problem to be solved, is the fact that by lowering the power of the light, I was making the strobe work around ambient level. And because it's working around ambient level, that means all other ambient sources, all continuous sources, any lights you have on in the room, any natural light making its way into the room, affects the color temperature and the quality of the light. That meant I needed something that could overpower the ambient light, but I also needed it to be syncable so that I could shoot wide open rather than having to shoot at f8 and just have everything in focus and have no real style, in my opinion. So that's when, and I believe this is probably now a common practice, but it's something that I came to the conclusion of. That's when I went out and got myself some ND filters. For those that don't know, an ND filter is essentially a piece of glass that is darker and it's in various stops of light down from ambient, so you can have like 1 stop removed or 4 stops removed or 8 stops removed, up to 10, 15 stops. And it's basically a piece of black glass that will stop a certain amount of light making its way through to your sensor, like this one here, which you can probably still see me through, but you can see how much light that's cutting out. So I got the ND filters, and it was quite lucky I hit the ground running really, because the first ones I bought were ND16s, which is 4 stops, and the first set I actually bought are right here. These are the first ones I bought, and I still use them literally to this day. And what it allows me to do is for me to set up my strobes at 4 stops higher than the aperture that I want, which will cut out any problems with ambient spill, color temperature problems and so on. It allows me to get the power out of the strobe that I want, but I'm able to cut out that light with the ND filter, so I end up with clean, decent quality light and the shallow depth of field that I want, because I can open up my aperture and still be shooting at 125th of a second and so on. As far as the types of ND filters, as far as a brand goes, for those that care, I use Hoya. Just always have always liked them. I use other filters, other brands for different jobs, but Hoya for my ND filters. I don't use variable NDs because in my experience, and this is limited only to my experience, I found that the quality of the end product is slightly compromised, and it's hard to explain, but I'm just not a fan of using, I've never been a fan of the images that I get from using variable NDs. So I bought ND filters for the lenses I knew I was going to use in studio. So I had 72 and 77mm, and I think it's 67mm, which was when I was using the 100mm macro in the studio a lot as well. So the positives and drawbacks of shooting in this way: well, because you're working with such a narrow depth of field, in a studio. It does, this is probably not the best way to sell this, but it does limit the amount of editing you have to do in terms of skin detail and issues with hair. Because you haven't got the detail front to back on the subject, you haven't got to worry about cleaning up absolutely every little tiny blemish, because a lot of it is just kind of melted away within what the depth of field is doing. And the main real benefit to me, and the reason I absolutely love shooting this way, and the reason I continue to shoot this way, is because it gives you a medium format look. It looks to me like you get that lovely medium format drop off. It feels a lot more filmic, which I know there's probably people banging their head against a desk saying that there's all these other contributing factors, but to me it very much, especially when I'm shooting in black and white in the studio, it has this beautiful drop off and it looks more medium format than what you get out of a standard full frame DSLR or mirrorless. The downsides to it are the fact that because you're shooting at a narrower depth of field, you might see a drop off in your sort of hit rate in terms of getting images in focus, and you very much have to adapt to shooting this way. So on that note, to talk you through the way that I would shoot if you were to attempt using ND filters in the studio, the first thing you'll need is a bright modeling light. Because you're cutting out so much light from the front, you want to make sure that you're still able to see through clearly. This especially applies to DSLRs. On the A7R3 it's a lot simpler, but on any DSLR you're going to find it's a little bit harder to see, especially as you go up and up with the ND filter that you use. I think it's important to inform the subject just to minimize their movement. Between shots is obviously fine, but when you're wanting to nail the focus on a shot, it's just to have them nice and calm and nice and still. You're going to need a steady hand or a tripod. I would say probably when you're starting this off, try it with a tripod, but if you are going to go handheld, you're going to really want to make sure that you're locked in, elbows tucked, and you're being fairly considered and strong in your approach. And the reason is because it'll improve your hit rate, because any movement from you is going to obviously move that very narrow depth of field, and you'll end up with a lot of images that are frustratingly out that you think could look really fantastic. And the last one, and this applies also to the way that I shoot in natural light, and I really try and emphasize this to people, is don't or absolutely do the bare minimum of focus and recompose. So by focus and recompose, a lot of people have like a center point focus. They focus on something and then they recompose the image. Well, the problem is that once you've focused, you've set that very narrow depth of field at a certain plane, and unless your recompose is absolutely mathematically perfect, you're going to have shifted the plane of focus and therefore probably have an out of focus image. So I actually have on the Canon, I have the joystick set up so I can move the focus point. I want to move the focus point over the nearest eye and then take that shot. If I do have to do any recomposing, it's a real bare minimum because the focus point spread is so great. And on the Sony, same scenario. One cool additional feature with the Sony is because it has the eye detect, I can actually just use the eye detect, although it does have a habit of trying to piss me off by always going to the back eye rather than the nearest eye. And on that note, I'll explain why always the nearest eye. So when you're doing this, if you're going to have a depth of field that falls off, if you have a subject turn 45 degrees away from you and you have obviously a depth of field that maybe won't stretch from one eye to the next one because it's that narrow, you'll want the nearest eye to be in focus. Otherwise it just looks like an out of focus image. It can make the person look a little bit simple, unfortunately. So that's one of the ways that I solved the problem of not enjoying doing studio work and struggling to find my style. There's a lot more to it, stuff that I'll go through in later videos, but the first key component to me improving in a studio was down to the ND filters and the ability to shoot wide open. I hope that helps those that are interested, and I hope you have a great day.